Hi, Lucy. Thank you so
Hello.
much for making the time for this little conversation. Yeah, I discovered you through Twitter, as I just mentioned, and I heard about your exciting work about reporting on the climate crisis, a lot of other important topics as well. But especially for this show, the climate crisis, of course, is very relevant. And yeah, maybe can we start a little bit with who you are, what you do, and we can go from there.
So I'm a British journalist. I'm currently based in Los Angeles. Before that, I was based in Colombia. And before that, I was based in London for 6 years, where I worked at the Huffington Post. I started off in print and then learned how to use a camera. So then I started filming, and now I am a multimedia journalist. So I produce radio programs, short documentaries, and also articles. And my focus is on the environment, but also on social justice. So I'm very interested in how human rights and climate change collide and the intersection where they meet. And it's very important for me to show the human element of climate change, because I think for a lot of people, especially those who don't have a science background, including me, I don't have a science background, it can be really overwhelming when you just hear all these figures and statistics. And I think people find that very hard to relate to. So I'm always trying to look for the human element in any climate change story.
Amazing. I mean, that's a very similar approach, which I love. And but I think because you have quite an impressive career now in this field, and I was wondering how did it all start? Like, why did you come up with this topic, right? Because as you say, that I mean, a lot of things you can report on, and of course there's some connection between different ones. But why exactly the topics you work on?
Well, it actually started when I read a book called Farmageddon, which honestly, if you haven't read it, it completely changed the way I thought about meat. And it's about the farming industry. And it really opened my eyes to what we're doing to the planet. And that sort of kickstarted my interest in the environment. And then I just started reading more and more, and then I would find other journalists who were covering it. And then this was while I was at the Huffington Post, and so I pitched my editor to let me start an environment section. So he let me start it, so I was sort of doing that on top of my other work responsibilities, and that really got me into it. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to go to Antarctica to film a documentary out there for HuffPost, and that kind of just cemented my passion for covering the environment.
And how, because I think it's very interesting what you said about combining these different topics, right? Because I think a lot of people always see this in quite isolation, to say, okay, we have climate as a big problem, and then we have, you know, social justice, all these things. But as you, I think, already mentioned, is that the connections are really present and really strong, but it's how you present them in a way that people understand them, right? Because I think the problem is always people look at topics too isolated often to really make a change.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've definitely noticed more and more coverage of particularly conflicts drawing in elements of climate change. So when you're looking at conflicts, for example, in Africa, and you really dig deep, a lot of the time, and you know, this is oversimplifying it, but a lot of the time, if you can get to the root cause of the conflict, it is around drought, it is around food shortage, water shortage, particularly if you look at Lake Chad, the conflicts that are happening in that area, a lot of the time it's because the lake is swiftly vanishing, and people are now left with this very small water resource, and you know, and there's still the same amount of people trying to use it, or if not more, because the population's grown. So it's really interesting for me to drill deep into these issues that on the surface don't seem to have anything to do with climate change. And then once you start actually looking at the root causes, you know, this other narrative emerges. So I find that fascinating, and particularly around food shortage. I you know, that is a topic that sort of terrifies me and blows my mind at the same time, particularly being in California, which produces a large amount of the US's food, I recently wrote an article on bees and the impact that pesticides had on bees and how that was then going to impact food supplies in the US. So everything seems to be linked to the environment.
And I think that's super fascinating to kind of find these links, right? But how do you push through it, right? Because I mean, it's fascinating how you say this fascination to dig deeper, right? Which is, as a scientist, I have a similar motivation, right? If you like look at science, you really want to understand. You want to understand how the world works. And as a scientist, you might look at the physics and chemistry and try to understand these things, and then you maybe look at the links, how the world is connected. But what lets you keep pushing, right? Because I imagine, at least personally, it's been quite tough sometimes because there's quite some resistance, right, for some of these things to be uncovered. Because some things are probably not. There's some interest. Some people might not have interest to do this. So how do you push through to say this is something that's worth to go through all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard, especially as a freelancer. Financially, a lot of the time you're funding yourself, so you have to be really passionate about what you're doing. And I think for me, whenever I come up against a block, or it feels like I'm hitting my head against a wall, you have to keep reminding yourself, okay, why did I get into this industry? Why am I doing this? I always joke with my friends, I didn't go into journalism for the money. So it's one of those jobs where you really have to be passionate about what you're doing. And I think especially with the climate and environment and global warming, you really need to have that drive to keep pushing, because you will come across a lot of people who don't believe the facts, and who are pretty narrow-minded, and for me it's about learning to communicate with those people, and how do I tell this story in a way that will reach people that might not necessarily be interested. So I recently went to Oklahoma to attend the annual bison health checkup. Okay. Which on the surface you think, okay, what's that got to do with environment or climate change? And I met a lot of very interesting people, a lot of cowboys, a lot of ranchers, who were all very interesting. And we started talking about climate change and the environment. And it turns out that the bison have, this really unique ability to help tallgrass prairie thrive. And tallgrass is actually a better and more reliable vegetation to be able to capture and store carbon, because when wildfires happen, they're a lot more resilient than trees are. So it sort of all comes back again to the climate. Just kind of, it's just about continually finding ways to tell stories that that can address a wider audience. I'm very conscious that I don't just write for people who already care about the climate, because for me that's not really the sort of people that I want to be reaching.
It's interesting to find the angle on any. It's fascinating, right? If you start with some angle, and then you find out actually it's climate crisis or climate change again. Maybe it's like one last question, because we talked about some of the challenges, but what are maybe also some of the rewarding moments? Like maybe some of, first of all, congratulations to your award. That's pretty amazing from the UN. But also in general, I think you mentioned Antarctica. Some of these things. I think what are maybe some of the highlights from this? Like, even if it's tough, what can be some of the highlights you found?
I think it's obviously getting an award is amazing, but the highlights for me have been when I have written a story about a community or about an activist, and they've got in touch with me, or someone from that community has got in touch with me afterwards and just said, thank you so much for listening to us. Thank you so much for allowing us to tell our story. I was recently in the Balkans reporting on the rivers out there and how hydropower plants were ruining the ecosystem in the rivers. And just after I'd finished reporting, one of the activists got in touch to say, oh, we've actually managed to put a halt to 3 of the hydro plants that were due to be planned. So it's really nice when I'm reporting on something and I actually see a change happening. And that was all from grassroots activists organizing themselves against the government, protesting, peacefully protesting. You know, they tied themselves to the machinery that had come in to build these plants. So that was really amazing to see. And then I reported on another story from Colombia up in the north on a group of indigenous tribes and how they were facing drought, and as a result a lot of them were dying from health issues related to lack of water, lack of clean water. And after I'd published the piece, I had someone from a student group get in touch with me to say that they had chosen this this issue as a case study for their project, and they were actually applying for funding to try and get some water infrastructure to this community and some ways that they would be able to filter water to make it drinkable. So that's, I mean, that was amazing for me. It was just something that is actually a real change. And sometimes it is hard. It does get a bit overwhelming and you think, what is this tiny story going to do in the grand scheme of things? So that's really nice when I hear back from those communities that it is actually making a difference.
So maybe one thing we could, maybe as an action point even from this video could be, if you read a good article, write the author about it and say thanks.
Yeah.
If you feel it, because I think often we don't thank each other enough for the work we do. Appreciation, I think also, as you say, really long way. I had this one moment on my train travel, right, where my friend would send me a screenshot of the bus travel he booked instead of a flight. And this made me so happy, right? It was a small thing, but this small things of appreciation in some way of your work can really help you to keep pushing, I think.
Yeah, I always try, if I read something from a journalist, I'll always try and contact them on Twitter and just say, I absolutely loved reading this, or I love watching this, because it can be pretty tough. Especially as we're pretty vilified at the moment in the US. We're not very popular.
I think I really like this action plan. So whoever watches this, if you want to do that, I think it would be amazing. Write everyone. Like just the people of course, what you like, right? And speak up on the things, what you care about. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lucy. It was really enjoyable.
Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me on. Take care.